My wife left a note saying SHES done with me, and taking everything. Then karma hit hard. You won't believe what my wife left behind when she walked out that door. She thought she had it all figured out. But what if I told you I saw this coming from miles away? I wasn't about to let her take everything without a fight. This is the story of how her betrayal turned into her downfall. And how I came out stronger in the end. Stay tuned, because you'll never guess what happens next. It all started with the smell of coffee. That warm, familiar aroma that always filled the kitchen in the early hours. The kind of scent that made you pause for a moment and think everything in the world was right. I remember the way the sunlight poured through the window blinds, casting soft stripes of light across the countertops. It should have been just another quiet morning, just me, my coffee, and the day ahead. But then I saw it. A note, neatly folded, sitting right there on the counter, almost as if it had been waiting for me. The second my eyes landed on it, I knew. Her handwriting was unmistakable, each curve of the letters etched into my memory. And suddenly, that perfect morning, that comforting scent, all of it felt wrong. I reached for the note, my fingers hesitating just before I touched the paper. I didn't want to open it. Something deep in my gut told me that whatever was inside, it would change everything. But I opened it anyway. I had to. The words hit me like a gut punch. I'm done with you. Your boring life. Your pathetic dreams. I'm taking everything. And by the way, this house? It's already sold. Enjoy what's left. I read it twice, hoping that somehow, the words would rearrange themselves into something else. Something less final. But they didn't. There it was, in plain black ink, spelled out as clearly as it could be. She was gone. Done. Finished. And she had taken everything. The first wave of emotion was confusion. Not anger, not heartbreak, just confusion. How could it come to this? We weren't perfect, sure, but I thought we were still in this together. We'd been married for years. We'd built this life, this home, these dreams. But over time, the woman I fell in love with started to change. She was magnetic when I first met her, confident, ambitious. A spark in every room she walked into. I admired her fire, her drive. But that fire? It burned hotter and brighter, and soon it wasn't just ambition anymore. It was something destructive. She wanted more. More money. More excitement. More everything. And me? I was never enough. I tried to keep up. God knows I tried. I worked long hours in software development. I saved. I planned. But every time I thought we were finally getting ahead, it wasn't enough for her. She laughed at my stability, mocked it, even. The career she used to be proud of became a punchline. Do you ever dream bigger, Alaric? She'd ask, swirling a glass of wine in her hand. Or are you just satisfied being ordinary? I'd smile, or try to, and pretend it didn't sting. But it did, every time. I started to feel like a placeholder in my own life. Like no matter how hard I worked, how much I tried to make her happy, it would never be enough. And then came the spending sprees. The designer handbags, the extravagant vacations, the kind of shopping trips that left our joint account bleeding. She didn't ask. She just spent. We deserve nice things, she'd say, waving me off. What's the point of working if we can't enjoy it? I told myself it was just a phase. Maybe she'd settle down. Maybe we'd find a middle ground. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't just a phase. It was who she was now. Someone who wasn't content. Someone who always needed more. The warning signs were everywhere. The late nights, the sudden business trips to cities she'd never traveled to before. I'd catch her turning her phone away when I walked into the room. Once, I saw a text pop up, just a name I didn't recognize, followed by a winking emoji. She'd closed the screen before I could say anything, brushing it off as a work thing. But I wasn't blind. I saw the shifts. I felt the distance. I just didn't want to admit it. And now, staring at that note in my hands, it was like the blinders had been ripped off. This wasn't just a rough patch. This wasn't just a fight or a phase. This was betrayal. I don't know how long I stood there, holding that piece of paper. Seconds? Minutes? I'm not sure. But eventually, I put it down. I didn't throw it away. I didn't tear it up. I just set it back on the counter, as if putting it down could make it disappear. The coffee in my mug had gone cold, but I took a sip anyway, hoping the bitterness would snap me out of whatever fog I was in. But it didn't. My heart was still pounding, my chest still tight. It felt like the walls of the kitchen were closing in. But I didn't lose it. I didn't shout, or cry, or punch a wall. I just stood there, letting it sink in. Because even though the words were sharp, even though they cut deep, they didn't surprise me. Not really. Deep down, I had known this was coming. I had seen the signs, felt the shift, heard the unspoken words between us. The only thing I hadn't known was when. And now I did. It was today, right now. And for some strange reason, knowing that gave me a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in months. I walked over to the sink, dumped the cold coffee, and rinsed out the mug. It was such a small, mundane act, but in that moment, it felt like the only thing I could control. I thought about what to do next. Call her? Beg her to come back? Shout into the phone and demand answers? But none of that felt right. None of that felt like me. Instead, I pulled out my phone and sent a single text. I saw your note. Thanks for the heads up. Short, to the point. No emotion, no begging. Because the truth was, I wasn't going to fight her. Not in the way she expected. If she thought she could break me, she was wrong. If she thought she could take everything and walk away clean, she was wrong again. She didn't know it, but I was ready for this. I had been ready for a long time. And as I set the phone down and turned off the kitchen light, one thought kept repeating in my mind, this isn't over. Not by a long shot. Looking back, the cracks in our relationship weren't sudden. They didn't just appear overnight. They started small, so small, in fact, that I ignored them at first. I convinced myself it was just the natural ebb and flow of a long marriage. But now, standing here alone in my kitchen, that note still burned into my memory. It all seemed so obvious. Those little cracks had been warning signs, flashing red lights that I chose to look past. And as much as I hated to admit it, they had been there for years. I remember the early days of our marriage. We were happy. At least, I thought we were. Serafina was magnetic, one of those people who could walk into a room, and everyone noticed. She had this energy about her, this confidence that I found intoxicating. When we met, she was just starting out in the corporate world, full of ambition and plans. I was drawn to that fire, that drive. She made me feel like we were building something together. And for a while, we were. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. It wasn't anything dramatic at first. Just little things. Serafina's smile, once so genuine, started to feel forced. Her laugh, the one I used to love hearing, began to sound hollow. I brushed it off as stress. She was climbing the ladder at work, taking on more responsibility. It made sense that she'd be tired, distracted. I told myself it was just a phase. Everyone goes through phases, right? But deep down, a part of me knew it was more than that. I just wasn't ready to face it. Then there were the late nights. The business dinners that went on a little too long. The weekend conferences in cities she never had to travel to before. At first, I believed her. Why wouldn't I? We'd always been honest with each other. I trusted her. But over time, her explanations started to feel rehearsed. She'd get defensive if I asked too many questions. Don't you trust me? She'd snap, her tone sharp enough to cut. Of course, I'd back off. I didn't want to be that guy, the insecure husband accusing his wife of things she hadn't done. But the doubt, it crept in. Slowly. Silently. Eating away at the foundation of everything we'd built. It wasn't just her words that changed, it was her actions too. She started spending more, a lot more. It wasn't just the occasional splurge on a nice handbag or a pair of shoes. No, this was different. Serafina was coming home with designer clothes, high-end jewelry, things we'd never talked about buying. We work hard, she'd say, waving me off when I asked about the price tags. We deserve nice things. But the bills were piling up, and our savings account, it was bleeding money. I tried to talk to her about it, tried to get her to see reason, but every time I brought it up, she'd dismiss me. Don't be such a buzzkill, Alaric. It's just money. Just money. That phrase haunted me. To Serafina, it really was just money. But to me, it was security. It was stability. It was the future we'd planned together. And the more she spent, the more I realized she didn't see it that way. She didn't care about the long term. She only cared about what made her happy in the moment. There was one night, a few months before everything fell apart, that sticks with me. She came home late again and I was waiting in the living room. The house was quiet, the only sound the ticking of the old clock on the wall. I asked her where she'd been. Her answer was vague, something about a client dinner running late. She wouldn't look me in the eye. I pressed her, just a little. Who were you with? I asked. She snapped. God, Alaric, why do you always have to interrogate me? Do you think I'm cheating on you or something? Her words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. I hadn't said it. I hadn't even thought it, at least not consciously. But there it was, out in the open. I tried to backpedal, to explain that I was just worried about her, about us. But she was already walking away, her heels clicking angrily against the hardwood floor. You're so paranoid, she threw over her shoulder. I can't do this right now. That was the night I started to really question everything. Not just her excuses, but myself. Was I paranoid? Was I reading too much into things? I stayed up late that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation, every argument, every little moment that had felt off. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that I was just being overly sensitive, that our marriage was still solid. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being played. And then there was her phone. I'd never cared about checking her phone before. We'd always had an unspoken agreement of trust. But lately, I noticed the way she kept it close, how she'd flip it face down on the table whenever I walked into the room. If it buzzed, she'd glance at it quickly and tuck it away. I tried not to let it bother me, but it did. One afternoon, while she was in the shower, I picked it up. My hands were shaking. I didn't know what I was looking for, and honestly, I didn't want to find anything. But as soon as I unlocked it, a text popped up on the screen. A name I didn't recognize. Can't wait to see you tonight. My stomach dropped. I put the phone down like it burned me and walked out of the room. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I knew was that something was terribly, terribly wrong. After that, everything changed. I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't ignore the late nights, the secretive phone calls, the money disappearing from our accounts. The woman I had fallen in love with, the woman I had married, was gone. In her place was someone I didn't recognize, someone who didn't care about our life together, who didn't care about me. She was distant, cold, and when she wasn't cold, she was angry. I started to feel like a stranger in my own home. Like I was the one intruding on her life, not the other way around. And then, of course, came the receipt. The final piece of the puzzle. I found it tucked into the back of her purse one night, when she left it on the counter. A hotel booking. A luxury suite for two. The date matched the weekend she'd told me she was at a business conference. My hands trembled as I held that piece of paper. It wasn't just suspicion anymore, it was proof. Proof that she had been lying to me, that she had been seeing someone else. I felt the floor drop out from under me. My chest tightened, my vision blurred. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, to scream and yell and ask why. But instead, I sat down at the kitchen table, that receipt in my hand, and I stared at it. I stared at it for what felt like hours. I didn't confront her that night. I didn't say a word. Instead, I waited. I watched. I let her believe she was getting away with it. I started keeping track of the money, of her movements, of every little lie she told. It was like living in a spy novel, except the enemy wasn't some foreign agent. It was my wife. And the worst part? I still loved her. I hated her for what she was doing, for how she had betrayed me, but I loved her. I wanted so desperately for her to stop, to wake up, to realize what she was doing and come back to me. But she didn't. And that's when I knew, this wasn't a phase. This wasn't something we could fix. This was who she was now. And if I didn't act, if I didn't protect myself, I was going to lose everything. The day I found the note was the day everything became clear. All those months of doubt, of suspicion, of wondering if I was just imagining things, they were over. I had my answer. She was done with me, and she was taking everything she could. But what she didn't know, what she could never have guessed, was that I had seen this coming. I wasn't going to let her win. Not like this. Not after everything we'd been through. She thought she had the upper hand, but she had no idea what was coming next. She left me with nothing. Or so she thought. What she doesn't know is that I've been preparing for this moment all along. The real question now is, what happens when she realizes I'm one step ahead? Do you think she'll beg for forgiveness, or double down and try to fight back? Type 1. If you think she'll beg. Type 2 if you think she'll fight back. Let me know what you think. When I started digging, I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. A part of me hoped I was wrong, that somehow all the inconsistencies and suspicions were just figments of my imagination. But another part of me, the one that had been silently keeping score, knew the truth. It wasn't paranoia, it was self-preservation. And the deeper I dug, the more the pieces began to fall into place. I began with the simplest thing, our bank statements. Late one night, I sat at the kitchen table with a stack of them in front of me, the only light coming from the dim bulb overhead. My coffee went cold as I traced every transaction, every withdrawal. I wasn't looking for anything obvious. I was looking for patterns. It started to feel like I was reading someone else's life, not my own. There were charges from high-end boutiques I'd never set foot in. $5,000 here, $3,000 there. Weekends at luxury spas I had never agreed to, and reservations at restaurants that charged more for a meal than I made in a week. The numbers didn't just add up. They told a story. One where Serafina was living a life I wasn't a part of. Then there was her phone. I never wanted to be that guy. The one who snooped, who rifled through personal messages, who crossed that line. But the longer she kept turning her screen away from me, the more I realized she was already the one who had crossed it. I wasn't looking for anything explicit. Just answers. Late one night, while she was out, I opened her laptop, an older MacBook she never used anymore. It was still connected to her iCloud account. I clicked on the Messages app, my hands trembling slightly, feeling the weight of what I was doing. And there it was, a series of texts to someone named Orion. The name itself didn't mean much, but the context did. Can't wait to see you. That last trip was amazing. We'll figure it out, he'll never know. My breath hitched. There it was, in plain text. Not some vague gut feeling or a misinterpreted glance. Proof. I didn't confront her, not yet. Instead, I saved the screenshots. I needed more. I needed the full picture, not just fragments. That's when I hired the private investigator. It wasn't an easy call to make. I felt a mixture of shame, anger, and cold determination. When I explained my situation, the investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Joan, didn't judge. She just listened and said, "Let me handle it." A week later, she sent me a detailed report, photos of Serafina and Orion at a high-end hotel downtown, time-stamped receipts of their shared dinners, and even a record of a weekend trip to Miami. Every page felt like another nail in the coffin. By the time I finished reading, there was no doubt left. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't overreacting. She was having an affair. And yet, even as the evidence piled up, I didn't say a word. Instead, I kept quiet and started preparing. I didn't just want to catch her in the act. I wanted to make sure that when the truth came out, I wasn't the one left holding the bag. I knew she'd try to take everything, our savings, our home, our future. So I began to move things around. Slowly. Methodically. The first opened a new bank account in my name only, and started redirecting my paychecks. Not all at once, just enough, so she wouldn't notice. I transferred our joint savings into that account over time, leaving behind just enough to keep up appearances. I even called our financial advisor, and quietly made sure that my retirement fund was locked down. I wasn't hiding assets, I was protecting them. There's a difference. The house was trickier. I knew Serafina would go after it. She always said it was her favorite thing about our life together, the one thing she couldn't live without. She had picked it out, decorated it, made it her own. And for years, I let her believe it was ours equally. But after the refinancing a few months earlier, I had made sure that legally, it was only mine. She hadn't noticed when she signed the paperwork. She was too busy dreaming of a future without me to look at the fine print. So I had it transferred to my name alone. If she wanted to sell it, she'd find out she didn't have the right. As all of this unfolded, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of clarity. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it wasn't controlling me anymore. It was fuel. I wasn't going to let her walk away with everything. I wasn't going to let her leave me in ruins while she ran off with Orion. I was going to protect what was mine, and I was going to do it quietly, without tipping her off. She thought she was in control, but she had no idea I was already 3 steps ahead. I didn't need revenge, not yet. I just needed to be ready. Because when the time came, when everything finally fell apart, I wanted to be able to look her in the eye and know that she had lost. I didn't want to yell. I didn't want to scream. I wanted her to see the full scope of her miscalculation. And as I stacked another file of evidence on my desk, I felt that moment drawing closer. The game was on, and for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of losing. I knew that if I wanted to come out of this mess with even a shred of stability, I needed to act carefully. My wife was reckless, yes, but not stupid. She'd notice if I made any drastic changes too soon. She'd spot it if I drained our accounts overnight, or signed over our biggest assets in a single week. No, I had to be smarter than that. I had to move in small, deliberate steps quietly, methodically, so she wouldn't suspect a thing. And that's exactly what I did. The first thing I did was open a new checking account in my name only. It was easy enough. A quick trip to the bank, some paperwork, and within an hour, I had a place to start funneling my paychecks. The trick was to do it gradually. I left enough of my salary in the joint account so that the day-to-day spending wouldn't set off any alarms. Serafina was used to having access to the money she needed for her lavish lifestyle. And if I suddenly cut that off, she'd start asking questions. So I let her keep buying the handbags, the designer shoes, the spa weekends. Let her think I wasn't paying attention. Meanwhile, each payday, I transferred a portion into my private account. Not much, just enough to start building a safety net. I knew it would take time, but time was something I had. She thought she was still in control. She thought I was still clueless. And that worked to my advantage. I started looking into our joint savings too. Over the years, we'd managed to stash away a decent amount, not enough to retire early, but enough to feel secure if we ever hit a rough patch. Except now, that savings wasn't safe anymore. I couldn't trust that it wouldn't be drained at any moment. So I made a few adjustments. At first, I only moved a little. A few $1,000s here, a few thousand there. Enough to keep it from drawing any attention, but enough to give me a cushion. I even set up a separate savings account, one she couldn't touch. It wasn't just about protecting the money. It was about giving myself options, about knowing that if, or rather, when this all fell apart, I wouldn't be completely at her mercy. One of the most challenging parts was the credit cards. Those little pieces of plastic were her lifeline. She used them for everything from big-ticket purchases to her daily coffee runs. Cutting her off completely would have been too obvious, so I had to be careful. I reviewed each statement, every line item, every purchase. I noted the patterns, which stores she frequented, how much she spent on each trip, what times of the month she tended to splurge. Once I had a clear picture, I made my move. I reported a few of the cards as lost or compromised, had them replaced in my name only. It took some explaining to the bank, some manufactured stories about fraud and identity theft, but in the end, it worked. By the time Serafina noticed, it was too late. Her cards stopped working one by one, and I played dumb when she asked. Must be an issue with the bank, I'd say, shrugging as I feigned concern. She bought it. For a while, at least. The house was the biggest piece of the puzzle. Serafina loved that house. She loved telling people how she had picked it out, how she had designed every room. She made it seem like it was her masterpiece, her castle. But legally, it wasn't hers anymore. Not since we refinanced. That was the beauty of it. Months earlier, when we'd updated our mortgage, I had quietly transferred ownership to my name alone. She hadn't noticed a thing. She was too busy planning her new life to read the fine print. So when the time came, when she decided she was done with me and ready to sell the house, she'd find out the hard way. She couldn't. It was mine. I started gathering all the necessary documentation, title deeds, mortgage statements, even the refinancing paperwork. I filed everything neatly, kept it in a secure place, ready for the day she tried to claim what wasn't hers. If she thought she could just walk away with the most valuable thing we owned, she was in for a rude awakening. I had the legal proof, the paper trail. There was no way she could take the house, not without my consent, and that consent was something she'd never get. As I made these changes, I kept thinking about what Serafina would do if she found out. Would she confront me? Would she accuse me of being underhanded? Or would she play the victim, claiming she didn't understand why I was being so cold, so calculating? The thought didn't scare me. If anything, it motivated me. I wasn't doing this to hurt her. I was doing it to protect myself. To protect what I had worked so hard to build. She could call me paranoid, selfish, even cruel. It didn't matter. What mattered was that when the dust settled, I would still have a foundation to stand on. I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came to a head. Serafina was smart, but her arrogance blinded her. She believed she was untouchable, that I would just roll over and accept whatever she threw at me. But that arrogance worked in my favor. It gave me the room I needed to make my moves, to secure my future. She didn't see it coming, not any of it. She thought she was the only one playing the game. But the truth was, I had been playing all along. I just hadn't shown my hand yet. Each step I took, every quiet adjustment, brought me closer to being ready. Ready for the moment she made her move. Ready for the moment I could look her in the eye and know, without a doubt, that I had done everything I could to protect myself. She thought she had it all figured out. She thought she was going to leave me with nothing. But when the time came, when she finally realized what I had been doing, the look on her face would be worth every careful step I had taken. I wasn't just protecting my finances. I was reclaiming my power. I wasn't going to let her walk away with everything. Not this time. Not ever. It was around that time I learned his name. Orion. I still remember the first time I saw it, tucked into her phone's contact list. Just Orion. No last name. No title. She had saved it like he was some mystical figure. A secret she thought I'd never uncover. At first, it didn't mean anything to me. It was just a name. But once I had it, once I started piecing it together with the evidence from the private investigator, everything started falling into place. He wasn't just a name anymore. He was a problem. My problem. And I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I wanted to know everything. Who he was, what he did, how he met Serafina. So I went digging. I spent nights combing through every scrap of information Joan, the pie, had handed me. Photos of him and Serafina at some upscale restaurant downtown. Credit card records showing a pattern of pricey hotel bookings. A receipt from a boutique jeweler. None of it screamed upstanding businessmen. In fact, the more I learned, the more it became clear that Orion was a con artist. He wasn't just charming my wife, he was using her. It didn't take long to figure out his game. Orion wasn't some successful entrepreneur, he was a parasite. He targeted women like Serafina, women who craved attention, who lived for status and luxury. Women who didn't look too closely at the details. His entire persona was smoke and mirrors. The flashy car? Leased under someone else's name. The consulting business he bragged about? Nothing more than a front to lure in new marks. Joan had tracked down old lawsuits, unpaid debts, and even a trail of other women he'd conned before Serafina. Each one followed the same pattern. He'd charm them, bleed them dry, then disappear. The more I learned, the more disgusted I felt. But I also started to see an opportunity. I knew I couldn't just confront him. That's not how someone like Orion operates. He'd deny everything, turn it around on me, maybe even spin a story that painted me as the villain. And Serafina? She'd defend him. That was her pattern. After all, always looking for the bigger, better deal, and always protecting her investment. If I stormed in with accusations, it wouldn't matter how much proof I had. She'd just dig in deeper. So I had to be smart about it. I had to make Orion's life harder. I had to make him see that Serafina wasn't worth his trouble anymore. My first move was quiet. I started forwarding Joan's findings to a few key people in Orion's orbit, creditors, former clients, even a few of the women he'd scammed before. Not all at once, and not from any email that could be traced back to me. It was slow, deliberate, and anonymous. Just enough to make them start asking questions. I wanted them to look at him differently, to doubt him. If I could shake their confidence in him, I knew it would ripple through his world. And it did. The first sign was when Joan sent me a photo of him leaving a meeting, looking rattled. She'd been tailing him, watching his routine, and she noticed he wasn't as composed as he had been. His polished exterior was starting to crack. I could see it in his posture, in the way he glanced over his shoulder. Orion wasn't used to people standing up to him. He wasn't used to someone knowing all his moves before he made them. Next, I dug into his finances. It turns out Orion wasn't just living off other people's money, he was drowning in debt. Credit card balances maxed out. A string of small claims lawsuits in his name. A history of bounced checks and failed business ventures. I gathered every scrap of evidence I could find and began anonymously leaking it to his creditors. Nothing dramatic, nothing all at once. Just enough to put pressure on him. To make him squirm. I knew if his financial situation worsened, it would put a strain on his relationship with Serafina. They thrived on the illusion of wealth and power. Without it, they'd turn on each other. It didn't take long. Joan called me one afternoon, her voice steady but tinged with excitement. "You'll want to see this," she said. She sent over a set of photos taken outside a boutique hotel. Orion and Serafina were arguing full-blown shouting match on the sidewalk. He was gesturing wildly, his face twisted in anger. She looked stunned, her hands up as if trying to calm him down. It was a side of him I hadn't seen before, and I knew it meant one thing. The pressure was working. Serafina started coming home later than usual. She'd walk in, her makeup slightly smudged, her hair less perfect than it used to be. She wasn't as smug, as sure of herself. I could tell she was worried. About what, exactly, I wasn't sure yet. But the cracks were showing. She didn't know I was behind it. She didn't even know that I knew his name. And that was my advantage. While she was scrambling to keep her perfect facade intact, I was dismantling their little world piece by piece. The best part? Orion couldn't figure out where it was all coming from. He didn't know who was feeding his creditors, his former clients, his ex-lovers. He didn't know why his carefully constructed life was suddenly collapsing. And he couldn't stop it. Every time he tried to patch one hole, another one opened. The late-night phone calls, the frantic texts Joan said he was spinning, trying to regain control. And Serafina? She was caught in the middle, watching the man she thought would save her begin to unravel. By the time Orion started pulling away, it was already too late for her. He realized she wasn't a safe bet anymore. She wasn't someone who could bail him out of his mess. She was just another liability. I could see it in the way Joan described their interactions, less affectionate, more transactional. The charm was gone, the promises of a better life, fading fast. And when he finally ghosted her, when he vanished without a word, I knew I had done what I set out to do. Orion was out of the picture. It wasn't about revenge, at least, that's what I told myself. It was about leveling the playing field. About making sure that when Serafina finally realized what she had done, she wouldn't have Orion to lean on. She'd be alone, standing in the ruins of her own choices. And as much as it hurt to see her go through that, I knew it was the only way. I wasn't trying to destroy her. I was trying to wake her up. But whether she woke up or not, that was on her. I had done my part. With Orion out of the picture, I could finally turn my full attention back to Serafina. For months, I'd been playing a quiet game of strategy, stacking the odds in my favor while she continued to live as if she was untouchable. But now it was time to make my move. Every step I took was deliberate. Every decision calculated. She had no idea that I'd been watching, planning, waiting. But she was about to find out. I started small. Not enough to alert her, but enough to make her uncomfortable. The first thing I did was close our joint credit card accounts. I waited until she was on one of her shopping sprees, probably buying another overpriced handbag, or a pair of shoes she didn't need, and then I pulled the plug. By the time she reached the register, her card was declined. I can only imagine her confusion, her frustration, as she tried to figure out what was going on. When she came home that night, she was fuming. "The bank screwed up," she said, tossing her purse onto the counter. "I had to put everything on my personal card. This is ridiculous." I just nodded, feigning concern. "That's strange," I said, keeping my tone calm. "I'll call them tomorrow." But I never did. Next, I moved on to our bank accounts. I'd already opened my own, but I still kept enough in the joint account to cover bills, groceries, and other day-to-day expenses. Now, I started transferring larger sums, always just under the daily transfer limit so it wouldn't raise any red flags. I left just enough in the joint account to make it look like nothing was wrong. Serafina was never one to check balances or monitor statements. She trusted that the money was always there. She didn't notice as the numbers dwindled, didn't see that I was slowly siphoning off our savings into an account she couldn't touch. By the time she realized something was off, it was already too late. Her spending habits became my next target. Serafina had always been a creature of luxury. Designer handbags, custom jewelry, expensive spa treatments, these weren't just occasional indulgences. They were a way of life. But with the credit cards closed and the joint account running dry, she started feeling the pinch. I remember one evening, she came home looking unusually subdued. "I had to cancel my spa appointment," she said, dropping her coat on the back of the chair. "The card kept declining, and I don't want to use my personal one anymore." I shrugged. "That's too bad," I said, hiding my satisfaction. "Maybe the bank's still having issues." She shot me a look, her frustration simmering just below the surface. But she didn't press me on it. Not yet. The house was my ace in the hole. I'd been sitting on that piece of information, waiting for the right moment. I knew how much the house meant to her. She had spent years decorating it, filling it with expensive furniture and art, turning it into a reflection of her image. She always referred to it as our house, but I knew better. After the refinancing, my name was the only one on the title. I knew that once she tried to sell it, or once she realized she couldn't, everything would come crashing down. So I waited. And while I waited, I prepared. I started gathering all the documentation I'd need to prove my case. Copies of the refinancing paperwork, bank statements showing the transfers, emails confirming the title change. I had it all. I even created a digital backup, just in case she tried to accuse me of tampering. By the time she found out the truth, I would be ready. No matter what she said or did, I had the evidence to show that every move I made was legal. Every transfer above board. She thought she was the one holding the cards, but I was the one controlling the game. The day it finally hit her was almost anticlimactic. She had been on the phone for hours, pacing back and forth in the living room. I could tell she was stressed, her voice was sharp, her tone clipped. When she finally hung up, she turned to me, her face pale. "I just spoke to the realtor," she said. "They said I can't sell the house. They said my name isn't on the title." I nodded slowly, pretending to be just as surprised as she was. "That's odd," I said. "Maybe it's a mistake." She shook her head, frustration turning to anger. "It's not a mistake, Alaric. They said the deed was signed over to you when we refinanced." She glared at me, waiting for an explanation. "Why would you do that?" I met her gaze, calm and steady. "You signed the papers," I said simply. "It was part of the refinancing agreement. You must have missed it." Her jaw tightened, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind. She didn't remember signing anything because she hadn't bothered to read it. She had trusted me to handle it, to take care of the details. And I had. I had taken care of everything, just not in the way she expected. She started to say something, then stopped. She was searching for a way to regain control, a way to turn this back on me. But there was nothing she could say. The documents were legally binding. The house was mine, and there wasn't a thing she could do about it. That night, she barely spoke to me. She spent hours in the bedroom, her phone glowing as she sent message after message. I knew she was reaching out to friends, maybe even lawyers, trying to figure out her next move. But I wasn't worried. I had played this hand carefully. Every decision I made was backed by documentation, every step supported by evidence. She thought she could outmaneuver me, but she had no idea how far ahead I was. I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about revenge, it was about balance. For too long, Serafina had taken and taken, always assuming I'd stand there and let her. But this time, I had protected myself. I had ensured that when she finally walked away, she wouldn't leave me in ruins. She would be the one scrambling, the one facing the consequences of her own actions. And as I lay in bed that night, listening to the faint sound of her typing furiously on her phone, I felt a strange sense of peace. The worst was over. The game was almost finished. And for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of what came next. The moment I'd been waiting for finally arrived, and yet, it felt nothing like I thought it would. I had spent months preparing for this, anticipating the fallout. And now it was here, raw, chaotic, and impossible to predict. Serafina was unraveling right in front of me, her carefully constructed life crumbling in real time. And the strange part? I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt calm. Like everything had been set in motion long ago. And all I needed to do was sit back and watch it play out. It started with her realizing that Orion had abandoned her. I could see it in her eyes the morning she stumbled into the kitchen, her phone clutched in one hand, her hair disheveled, her usually flawless appearance marred by dark circles under her eyes. She didn't say a word as she poured herself a cup of coffee, the trembling in her hands betraying her facade of composure. I watched her out of the corner of my eye, pretending to scroll through my emails on my laptop. She sat down across from me, staring into her mug like it held some kind of answer. I waited. I knew she'd speak first. "He's gone," she finally muttered, barely audible. Her voice was hoarse, her words weighted with exhaustion. I raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Who's gone?" She looked up, her eyes narrowing. "You know who." I set my laptop aside, leaning back in my chair. "Orion?" She flinched at the name, like it physically hurt her to hear it. I could tell she was struggling to keep her emotions in check. "He left. No warning, no explanation." "I see." I nodded slowly, as if digesting the information for the first time. Inside, I felt a pang of satisfaction. It had happened sooner than I'd expected. I had thought he'd hold out longer, try to string her along for a few more weeks. But I suppose when the money ran out and the pressure mounted, he did what men like him always do, cut and run. And now she was sitting here, across from me, trying to make sense of it all. "What do you think I should do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I tilted my head, considering her question. What did she expect me to say? That she should call him? Beg him to come back? Try to fix whatever had gone wrong? I wasn't about to give her that. Instead, I said, "Maybe it's time to start focusing on yourself." She let out a bitter laugh. "What the hell does that even mean?" "It means," I said evenly, "that maybe you've been looking for happiness in all the wrong places." Her eyes flashed with anger. "So this is my fault, then? I drove him away?" I held her gaze, refusing to back down. "I'm not saying that. But if you're looking for answers, maybe you should start by looking in the mirror." Her expression hardened, her hands clenching around her coffee mug. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" I said, my voice steady. "I've been watching this play out for months, Serafina. And let's be honest, you knew this was coming. You knew who he was, deep down. You just didn't want to admit it." She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. The silence between us stretched on, heavy and charged. I could see the battle going on inside her, the denial, the anger, the realization. She wasn't ready to accept the truth, but she couldn't deny it anymore, either. I didn't press her. I didn't need to. The cracks were there. The seeds of doubt had been planted. All I had to do was wait. For the next few days, Serafina was a shadow of her former self. She stayed in the bedroom. Most of the time, the door closed, her phone constantly in her hand. I knew she was trying to contact him, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. But I also knew she wouldn't find any answers. Orion was gone, and he wasn't coming back. He had used her, drained her, and moved on. And now she was left with nothing but questions and regret. It wasn't long before she turned her frustration back on me. One evening, as I was reading in the living room, she stormed in, her face flushed with anger. "You knew, didn't you?" she accused, her voice sharp and cutting. "Knew what?" I asked, looking up from my book. "You knew he was going to leave. You knew he wasn't who he said he was." I closed the book, setting it on the coffee table. I might have had my suspicions. She stared at me, her eyes blazing. "And you didn't tell me?" I met her gaze, calm and unflinching. "Would you have listened?" Her mouth opened, then shut again. She looked away, her shoulders sagging. "You should have warned me," she muttered. "I tried," I said quietly. "But you were so convinced you had it all figured out. I wasn't going to waste my breath." She sank into the chair across from me, her anger giving way to exhaustion. "I don't know what to do now," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You start over," I said simply. "You pick up the pieces and figure out what's next." Her laugh was hollow, bitter. "And what pieces are those, Alaric?" "He took everything. I have nothing left." I shook my head. "You have yourself. That's where you start." She didn't respond, just stared at the floor, lost in thought. I knew it wasn't the answer she wanted to hear. She wanted me to fix it, to make it all better. But that wasn't my responsibility anymore. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. All I could do was watch as the woman I once loved faced the consequences of her own actions. It wasn't satisfying. It wasn't what I'd imagined it would be. I thought seeing her fall apart would bring me some kind of closure, some sense of justice. But in the end, it just felt empty. There was no victory here, no triumph. Just a quiet, inevitable conclusion to a story that had been doomed from the start. And as I sat there, watching her unravel, I realized that the real battle wasn't between her and me. It was within her. And it always had been. She was losing everything. It wasn't just Orion's disappearance. It was the reality that, for the first time in her life, Serafina had no control over the situation. I could see it in the way she carried herself around the house, no longer the poised, self-assured woman she pretended to be. Now, she was restless. Her frustration was palpable, like an electric charge that filled the air between us. She tried to keep it together at first, acting like she had a plan. But it was obvious she didn't. She'd go days without speaking to me, sitting on the couch for hours, staring at her phone as if willing him to call. The confident, domineering woman I once knew was gone, replaced by someone who looked like she didn't know how to survive without the illusion of power. It was almost painful to watch. Almost. Part of me wanted to reach out, to tell her it didn't have to be this way. But every time I thought about it, I remembered how we got here. I thought about the lies, the betrayal, the nights I lay awake while she was out with him. And that made it easier to stay quiet, to let her figure this out on her own. She was reaping what she'd sown, and I couldn't bring myself to intervene. The shift was gradual but unmistakable. Her usual shopping trips became shorter and less frequent. The designer bags and jewelry stopped showing up at the house. The packages that used to arrive like clockwork every week slowed to a trickle. I realized it wasn't just the lack of credit cards, or the dwindling funds, it was that she didn't know who to be without them. Serafina had built her identity around her lifestyle, her image. Take that away, and what was left? She didn't know. And the more I watched, the clearer it became that she wasn't ready to face that question. I stayed out of her way, letting her come to terms with her situation on her own. But it wasn't long before her anger found its target: me. One afternoon, I came home from work to find her waiting for me in the kitchen. She was standing by the counter, arms crossed, her face set in a hard line. The moment I walked in, she turned toward me, her eyes narrowing. "What the hell did you do?" she demanded. I set my bag down and raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," she said, her voice sharp. "Orion's gone, the house isn't in my name, and I can't access any of the money. Did you plan this? Did you do this on purpose?" I leaned against the counter, keeping my expression neutral. "Why would I do that, Serafina?" "Don't play dumb with me," she snapped. "You knew what was going on, you knew about him. And instead of confronting me, you just, what? You waited for it all to fall apart?" I met her gaze, calm and steady. "I didn't have to wait for anything. You made your choices. I just made sure I'd be okay when the dust settled." She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You think you're so clever, don't you? You think you've won." I shrugged. "It's not about winning. It's about protecting myself." Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, and for a moment, I thought she might throw something. But instead, she just stared at me, her anger slowly giving way to something else. Something that almost looked like defeat. "You think this is over," she said quietly. "You think you're free of me. But it's not that simple." "No," I agreed. "It's not simple. But it's done." She didn't respond. She just turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there. I could hear her footsteps retreating down the hall, the sound of the bedroom door closing. I exhaled, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Relief, yes, but also a lingering sense of sadness. This wasn't how I wanted things to end, but it was the only way they could. The days that followed were tense. We barely spoke to each other, passing like strangers in the same house. I started staying out later, finding excuses to avoid being home. When I did come back, she was usually locked away in the bedroom, the glow of her phone screen visible through the crack in the door. I knew she was looking for a way out, trying to figure out her next move. But I also knew she was running out of options. One evening, as I was sitting in the living room, she appeared in the doorway. She looked different, tired, yes, but also resigned. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there watching me. Finally she spoke. "I don't know how we got here," she said softly. "I don't know how it came to this." I looked up at her, meeting her gaze. "We got here because of choices. Yours, mine. They add up." She walked into the room, sitting down on the edge of the couch. "Do you hate me?" she asked. I thought about it for a moment. Did I? There was a time when I might have said yes. When the anger was fresh, when the betrayal still stung like an open wound. But now? I shook my head. "No. I don't hate you. But I can't go back. We can't go back." She nodded slowly, staring at her hands. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "Everything's gone. Everything I thought I had, everything I thought I could count on. It's just gone." "I know," I said quietly, "and I'm sorry. But this isn't something I can fix." She looked up at me, her eyes searching mine. "So that's it? We just, what? Pretend the last few years never happened?" "No," I said firmly. "We remember, we learn from it. And then we move on." She was silent for a long time. Then she stood, smoothing her hands over her skirt. "I guess I'll start packing," she said, her voice barely audible. I watched her walk away, her shoulders slumped, her steps slow. I didn't stop her. I didn't say anything. Because I knew that this was the end of us, the end of whatever illusion we'd both been clinging to. And as much as it hurt, as much as it felt like losing something I once held dear, I also knew it was necessary. It was time to let go. It was time to move on. It's strange how the silence sets in. After all the yelling, the accusations, the chaos, it's the quiet that lingers. The house feels bigger now, as if the walls have pulled back, creating more space than I know what to do with. Serafina is gone, her suitcases dragged out in the early morning, while I stayed in the kitchen, sipping a cup of coffee that had gone cold long before I ever picked it up. I didn't watch her leave. I didn't say goodbye. What was there left to say? She walked out the front door without looking back, and I stayed behind, staring at the empty mug in my hands. When I finally heard the car pull away, I exhaled a breath I didn't even know I was holding. I thought it would feel different, this moment of freedom. For months, I had pictured what it would be like once she was gone, once all the weight she brought with her was finally lifted. I imagined the relief, the satisfaction, the peace. And yet, as I stood there in the kitchen, listening to the faint hum of the fridge and the creak of the floor beneath my feet, it felt hollow. Not bad, exactly. Just empty. A void where so many years had once been. It's not like I hadn't prepared for this. I'd seen the writing on the wall long before Serafina left that note on the counter. I had been bracing for this day, setting the pieces in place so that when it finally happened, I'd be ready. And I was. Financially, at least. The house is mine, the accounts are secure, and I don't have to worry about her draining me dry. But there's a part of me that wonders, what now? What do I do with all this space, all this time? The routines we built together, even the ones I came to resent, are gone. The Sunday mornings when she insisted on brunch at that overpriced bistro downtown. The Friday nights when she'd invite her friends over and turn our living room into some kind of pop-up boutique. Even the arguments, the tension, the long stretches of silence between us, all of it is gone. And now I'm left with the quiet. I keep telling myself this is a fresh start, a clean slate. That's what everyone says, right? When something ends, it's an opportunity to begin again. But where do you even begin? I sit down at my desk and open my laptop, staring at the blank document on the screen. I thought maybe I'd start journaling, get my thoughts down, figure out what I really want. But the words don't come. I type a few sentences, delete them, then try again. Nothing feels right. I close the laptop and lean back in my chair, looking out the window at the backyard. The leaves are starting to change color, the edges tinged with orange and gold. It's peaceful out there, almost too peaceful. It reminds me of the life I thought I wanted: the house, the steady job, the quiet evenings at home. But now, I wonder if I ever really wanted that at all. Or if it was just something I convinced myself to want because it seemed easier than chasing something else. I've thought about calling someone, an old friend, maybe. But every time I pick up my phone, I put it down again. It's not that I don't want to talk. It's that I don't know what to say. How do you explain to someone that you're not sad, not angry, not relieved, just numb? That's the word that keeps coming back to me. Numb. Like the part of me that should feel something has gone quiet, too. Eventually, I force myself to get up and move. I go for a run around the neighborhood, my feet hitting the pavement in a steady rhythm. The air is crisp, cool against my skin. It feels good to be outside, to breathe in something other than the still air of the house. As I run, my mind starts to wander. I think about the early days with Serafina, when everything felt new and exciting. When I'd look at her and see the future I thought I wanted. I think about the little moments that used to make me smile, the way she'd hum to herself. When she was cooking, the way she'd laugh at her own jokes, the way she'd curl up on the couch with a glass of wine and lose herself in a book. Those moments feel like a lifetime ago. I don't know if I miss them, or if I just miss the version of myself that existed back then. When I get back home, I take a long shower, letting the hot water wash away the sweat and the heaviness that still clings to me. I stand there for a while, eyes closed, trying to clear my mind. But it doesn't work. The memories keep coming back, uninvited. They're not all bad. Some of them are good, even sweet. But they hurt all the same because they're gone now. Because I know I can't go back. Because I don't know what comes next. I dry off and get dressed, then head downstairs to make something to eat. The kitchen feels different without her. It's just a room now. Not the place where we used to talk about our day, or argue over who forgot to pick up milk. I make a sandwich, sit down at the table, and eat in silence. The food tastes fine, but I barely notice. I finish quickly and put the plate in the sink, then stand there for a moment, staring out the window at the darkening sky. The sun is setting, casting long shadows across the backyard. It's beautiful in a way that feels bittersweet. That night, I try to sleep, but the bed feels too big. I lie there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet. I've never minded silence before, but now it feels heavier, like it's pressing down on me. I turn on the TV, hoping the sound will help. But I can't focus on the images flickering on the screen. Eventually, I turn it off and close my eyes, willing sleep to come. When it finally does, it's restless and full of fragmented dreams. The next morning, I wake up early, the sky just starting to lighten. I sit on the edge of the bed, rubbing my face with my hands. I know I can't keep doing this, wandering through the days like a ghost, waiting for something to happen. I have to figure out what's next. I have to find a way to move forward. But for now, I just sit there, watching the sun rise, listening to the house creak and settle around me. It's not much, but it's a start. You've seen how it all played out. She thought she could take it all, but in the end, she was left with nothing. If you've ever been betrayed or underestimated, you know how good it feels to come out on top. So tell me, if you were in my shoes, would you have done the same? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. I've got more stories you won't believe. This experience taught me a hard truth. Trust is not a blind guarantee, it's earned, protected, and checked. In America, where financial independence is everything, never let someone have full control over what you worked so hard to build. Read every line, pay attention to every detail, and never assume someone has your best interests at heart just because you care for them. Love shouldn't come at the cost of your security. If something feels off, it probably is. Protect yourself first. That's not paranoia, it's survival. Believe me, you'll thank yourself later.